Hi, welcome. I'm Andrew David Edwards from Oxford, and I'm really excited to introduce the Money and Politics in U.S. History panel here at Session C. So our panelists are Nathan Tankus from Clarke Business Law Institute at Cornell Law School, David M.P. Freund from the University of Maryland, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, and Jakob Feidig from Binghamton SUNY. So Nathan, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. I think I'm going to stand up, but I'm a loud enough person, you'll be able to hear me. So my story is about, as the title says, the constitutionality of Antebellum American money, which we'll get into what exactly that means in a second. But essentially my story is, there's a lot of early American history. Obviously the conference was introduced by Christine Tizan, who started with the constitutional law of money in the United States, and that story, tracing back that story, brought her to Britain. My story is going forward from that, but before I go forward, I have to go back and kind of go through some of the legal history that has been documented in those kinds of works. The reason I have to go back is because of Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution. There's a lot in there, most notably not in this quote, is not having gold and silver. States can't make anything but gold and silver a legal tender. But this is the essence of what my talk is about, is emitting bills of credit. The fact that the Constitution bans states from emitting bills of credit kind of just thrown in there, but it's actually extremely important to understanding the Constitution and everything that was going on politically with the Founding Fathers, as we know them now, and setting up the American project. But my problem, what I'm trying to nail down, is what exactly is a bill of credit. So this gets me into bill of credit as homonym, the idea that we have these compound words that mean many different things or evoke many different meanings, but then we have a whole, and law is full of homonyms. How there's almost any sort of like broad concept, there's many different meanings you can invoke. Notably would be competition is something that you can find all throughout law, law, but never nailed down to precisely one definition. So the project is to deal with and analyze and kind of get rid of homonyms in phrases, in terms of art. And I'm doing this specifically for this legal term, or treating it as a legal term, bill of credit. My argument is that in the colonial meaning of bill of credit legally, was a bearer instrument that is receivable in payment for public dues, meaning you can pay your taxes to it. But we'll get into this a little bit later on, that if you owe debt to a land bank, you can pay your land bank loan with it. It's not a legal tender definition. It's not defined as being a legal tender, which I'll get into more in a little bit. And and as I'm saying, that we know that because it distinctly enumerates a banning on making other things legal tender. It would be sort of, it would be repetitive, or it wouldn't. If it didn't have a distinct meaning, they wouldn't need to say something about its distinct meaning, big distinct enumerations in the Constitution. And the reason, there are many different reasons where you can point to, but one quick, easy way in terms of representation, that you can know that bills of credit, their legal meaning isn't about legal tender, is that we have this British Act, the Currency Act of 1764, which bans the colonies from issuing legal tender bills of credit, but still allows non-legal tender bills of credit to be issued that with the approval of the Privy Council, which was basically advisors to the Queen, who it's an administrative responsibility. And this was seen as kind of trivial. It's like, okay, they need approval for the issuing a non-legal tender for non-legal tender bills of credit, but if we need it, they'll let it happen. Because otherwise they would just, if they're not going to let it happen, then they just banned all paper money in the colonies. And there's a reason, and if they wanted to do that, they would have just done that. But nonetheless, later on, the Privy Council doesn't approve bills of credit, non-legal tender bills of credit issuances in, I believe it's New York and New Jersey. And this is Joseph Galloway, who was in a letter to Benjamin Franklin, who's a close colleague of Benjamin Franklin, who becomes a loyalist as the rebellion from Britain becomes more patriotic, in the sense of that time period, is going off about how incoherent these decisions from the Privy Council is. That if all of these papers, to give more of the context of what the Privy Council doesn't just not allow the issuance of non-legal tender bills of credit. What they say specifically in their justification is that making the notes acceptable in payment of taxes and other public dues is a form of legal tender, and thus makes it against the Currency Act of 1763. But of course, that's not the meaning of legal tender, because the whole point of the original act was distinguishing these concepts. And if you say that, then what you're essentially saying is they can't issue any paper money at all, or any bills of credit at all, because there's nothing else to redeem it. The minimum way we have to redeem our currency is to accept it back in payment of taxes. And this is where this quote comes from, is, if he pledges land for a paper, then he should be able to pay off his loan, his collateralized loan, with that paper. Just as anyone who issues an IOU, you should be able to proffer that IOU in payment to them. If I give you an IOU because you give me, a meal, you should, if somehow, if somehow later I buy a meal on your behalf, you should be able to say, oh, we're settled. The IOU cancels out. But then they're suddenly saying, well, that means that it's legal tender, that this has a legal tender meaning, and thus it's all banned by the Currency Act of 1764, which there's a lot of work on this. Specifically, I'd point out Professor Edwards' work dealing with the political fallout ends of these kinds of arguments. Which brings me to the revolutionary Continentals, is that they have the same legal meaning. They're carrying this legal meaning forward. It's still taxes that are redeeming these bills of credit. It's just the taxes are at the individual colony level, and they're being issued by the Continental Congress, which causes problems. I mean, I have to, it's a thrill to do this presentation and see Professor Grubb nod along as I go through this, because this is obviously he can very easily tell I'm leaning quite heavily on his work here. But the main what comes out of this is that rather than this sort of traditional story, there's hyperinflation because of the Revolutionary War issuing of these continental dollars. What instead happens is they hit up a roadblock where they're issuing bills of credit, which are being redeemed by redemption taxes, but they legislate the redemption taxes further and further into the future, which means they're worth less now, but not because of inflation, but just because it's essentially a long maturity bond rather than a short maturity bond. They try to change the whole structure, make these bills of credit legal tender, in order to kind of restructure the system, but that destabilizes the whole redemption process, causes a lot of uncertainty, and what they end up deciding to do is then repeal the legal tender laws they've passed, and I'm just, for the purpose of this, simplifying, saying that they're making it receivable at that colonies then end up making the notes receivable at 1/40th their face value, but as far as you can talk to Professor Clarke and say that it's not, we don't quite precisely know what each individual state does. All we know is that they start collecting a lot more notes, but there's no evidence that they raise taxes to redeem those notes. This is a sort of drive-by, very quick retelling of a lot of work, which, you should look elsewhere and will be elsewhere in the paper that I write on this, or in the paper that I finish on this. What the broader point that comes out of this is all the legal and economic debates that are happening through the colonies, through the Revolutionary War, up till the Constitution, are using this conception of what a bill of credit is. This is what they're arguing about, that it's a bare instrument that's acceptable in payment of public dues, and many of these same people who are involved in the Revolutionary War, involved in the Continental Congress, are involved in the Constitution. I mean, Benjamin Franklin, he literally printed, the Pennsylvania Colonial Bills of Credit. He designed, he had influence on the design of the currencies themselves. He had influence on continental dollars. Benjamin Franklin and people around him and other people who were involved in the system know what they were talking about in their earlier policy decisions. But nonetheless, they banned the state issuance of bills of credit for various political reasons, which could be its whole other presentation, in fact, is other books. But they're left with a problem. It's like, okay, we banned states from issuing paper money, but we haven't enumerated that the federal government is going to issue paper money. We haven't created a new federal system to replace this old system. What is the money going to be? Well, the money has already started to come into existence. It's chartered state banks. State banks are chartered, then you get a charter from the government. At this point, it's a special act of the legislature. Later on, there will be incorporation acts. But you're getting a charter, and what's precisely the issue is what the charter is granting, or so I will argue, is that the charter is granting that your notes are receivable in payment of taxes. That's what's generating the money to this bills of credit. But wait, now I was talking earlier, a bill of credit is a bare instrument that receivable in payment of taxes. Does that make these banknotes bills of credit? Are they unconstitutional? If a bank emits a bill of credit because they were granted a charter from a state, is that them emitting a bill of credit on behalf of the state? And this isn't just me coming to this literature later on and just imposing, my understanding now onto them. There are contemporaries who are making this argument. William Harris Proctor is somewhat of a forgotten figure, but an important one. He was Treasury Secretary during the 1810s in the War of 1812 and the aftermath of the War of 1812. He was a potential presidential candidate, kind of forgotten figure, but important in politics in the beginning of the 19th century, going into the 1820s. And this is what he says in the debate over the rechartering of the first, what came to be known as the first bank in the United States. He's responding to arguments that are saying this bank in the United States is unconstitutional. He's saying not only is the bank in the United States not constitutional, but actually all your state banks are unconstitutional. All of them are delegating a power that they have no right to delegate. This is not what the Constitution allowed. The Constitution is specifically banning what you're doing, and if you think through this at all, this should be allowed. Now, of course, that's a huge legal issue, because if we're saying that we're going to ban all bills, state chartered banknotes, what we're essentially saying is we're going to deconstruct the entire monetary system of the U.S., of the burgeoning U.S. that's just coming to form as a nation without anything to replace it, just because of this technicality. And so what you see in in this is that it becomes a contested legal issue. So this is a dissent to Craig v. Missouri, which is a Supreme Court case all about Missouri issuing certificates that are receivable in payment of taxes but pay interest. And the majority is finding these as unconstitutional because of the bills of credit ban. But here the justice is making the case that if you kind of go down this road, then just like Crawford says, it's unconstitutional. And basically, this really gets settled in Briscoe v. Bank of Kentucky. What happens in this is a kind of even more ridiculous case, because this, in the normal cases is what Judge Joseph Story is talking about here, who, by the way, was a bank president of a state chartered bank while he was on the Supreme Court. He's the dissent here, but I'll get to the majority decision sort of settles this issue, because what it says is that even if a state bank is owned by the state, its issuance of banknotes isn't against the ban on emitting bills of credit, because it's a completely distinct entity. It's founded on its own capital. They created a corporation to do it. It's not them themselves, so it's not them emitting it, even though the basis of their capital is a set of bonds that Kentucky hands over to the bank to be the basis of the bank. So essentially, we hand an IOU to one hand, and then we say, you can now issue IOUs, but it's totally not us. It's just a corporation that we've chartered, and that, for some reason, gets one more minute? Sure. So to finish up here, when you hit this case, Briscoe v. Bank of Kentucky kind of settles this issue, and dissent and Story thinks this is going too far, but nonetheless he has this argument why even if you rule these Bank of Kentucky notes as unconstitutional, that still private banks would be, or quote unquote private banks or state charter banks that have private stockholders would still be constitutional. Problem, of course, is, as I've been arguing, the previous legal meaning, which this is all based on, is based on tax receivability. So it beggars belief that it is the capital of the bank that is the sole backing of these notes, because why would they need a charter in the first place? They could be private individuals and issue promissory notes on the basis of their own credit. So to finish up, the reason I want to excavate this example and write more about these decisions with this broader understanding, which I think has only really come across in the last 15 years or so, is that I think it's an interesting example of courts ruling a certain way for financial stability reasons. They're saying, they're not explicitly saying it, but if you read closely, what they're essentially saying is we can't rule these notes as unconstitutional because that would cause, catastrophe, and we're just a court. We can't overreach this way. And I think that it is that there are similarities and lessons to be learned from it in terms of understanding the cases in the Eurozone now with over the legality of open outright monetary transactions, which was settled in, or was dealt with in Goldweier v. Deutsche Bundestag, and now in the case that just dropped this week, this Tuesday, it's specifically Weiss versus Deutsche Bundestag. And so, where I want to go with this is have more of these historical comparative examples of courts ruling in a certain way for financial stability reasons, and kind of being a second legal layer to lender of last resort operations. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. How are you? Thank you very much for being here. It's a thrill to be part of this conference. I have to put on my reading glasses here, so bear with me. So what I'm going to introduce today, is this better? Okay. I'm going to introduce a forthcoming essay. It's coming out in the next couple weeks, actually, in an edited volume. It's about the federal state's role in shaping American finance in the early 20th century. It's drawn from a book manuscript in progress, so I welcome your thoughts on any piece of this. So the focus of this project is a period of revolutionary structural change in American banking. It begins with the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, culminates with the Banking Act of 1935. During that time, the U.S. government assumed extraordinary new powers over the banking sector and the money supply, and notably, and really the heart of my talk today, the political controversy that accompanied these changes hardly registers in conventional treatments of the era. No one denies the impact of the state's new capacity, nor that it was controversial. But historians and economists alike treat the dissent, which was very lively at the time, as largely inconsequential. Instead, we learn that policymakers and scholars eventually put those controversies to rest by reaching a consensus, both about the nature of money and about the central bank's responsibilities. I argue here instead that these reforms changed fundamentally the relationship between money and the state, and that the debate helped to mask this fact. Put simply, the controversy of the era was resolved when contemporaries embraced a reiteration of classical quantity theory that reconciled them to a new degree of federal oversight. Now, we all know that quantity theory has since been foundational to scholarship on financial history and policy. And for this reason, the era's debate over federal power, and inseparable from that, the debate over the nature of money, has shaped fundamentally our understanding of American state building. I'm arguing that it validated a view of finance which has prevented scholars from reckoning with some of the federal government's most powerful tools for driving economic growth and shaping its outcomes. So this forthcoming essay has three components, and I'm going to summarize them here. First, it discusses a basic restructuring of the nation's money supply. I begin with the Fed's founding. I explore changes to its practices during World War I, and then the growing importance of open market operations in the 1920s. And I finally conclude with the spate of emergency banking measures that were signed by Hoover and Roosevelt between 1932 and 1935. So this section is a really deep dive into the weeds of banking practice and federal oversight, and it details, I argue, a revolution both in the nature of banking assets and the role of state power. And the outcome of this story is best marked, I think, by two things. On the one hand, the mechanics of monetary creation changed. And second, Treasury securities came to play a very important role in that process. Now, we know that new money enters circulation in the economy not when the Fed supplements the reserve accounts of its members, but rather when banks extend loans or make investments. They create new checkable deposits. They don't create Federal Reserve notes. Obviously, they distribute those later when there's a need for cash. And before the 1910s, these new deposits, these new bank deposits, entered circulation for the most part only when banks had faith in their borrowers' commercial assets, as well as sufficient reserves of mixed origin to justify the loan. So most monetary creation was commercial in origin, and the federal government's debt played a limited and increasingly untenable role in maintaining the money supply. That's a relic of the National Banking Act, which has been mentioned a few times today. Now, jump ahead to the mid-1930s, and new bank deposits were increasingly created against collateral viewed by contemporaries as comparatively illiquid, most notably securities and real estate, and against reserves collateralized primarily by government bonds. So in the older system, banks generally created money to accommodate the production or exchange of identifiable commercial wealth. In the new system, banks increasingly created money to accommodate the production or exchange of comparatively risky assets, and the Treasury's debt backed a far larger proportion of the banking system's reserves. So that's the asset and policy revolution that I'm arguing for here. And note especially the decisive shift in federal priorities. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 assigned the U.S. government unprecedented authority to stabilize the banking sector, but it tasked it neither with determining how much money circulated in the economy, i.e. its supply, nor with backing that supply or securing its worth. The central bank's architects were adamant that these were not public responsibilities. Again, jump ahead to the 1930s, and the federal state had assumed the power to adjust actively the money supply and to ensure its value. reform had rejected a principle long held sacred that commercial needs would determine the currency supply and that a combination of commercial wealth and precious metals would stand behind the dollar's value. The second component of the essay focuses on the political controversy over these changes, and again, its virtual disappearance from scholarship on reform. The dissent began during World War I when the Fed changed the rules for rediscounting and manipulated its interest rates to finance the Liberty bond drives. A considerable portion of those sales were financed on margin. Banks lent money to bond buyers, so banks created new money and increased its supply by accepting the treasury bonds as collateral. In simplest terms, US government debt served as collateral for monetary creation. Next, when open market operations became a key tool of monetary management in the 1920s, financiers and politicians alike lamented the central bank's heavy reliance upon a trade in treasury securities. Now, it was only after World War I that the Fed began to depend upon open market operations to manage the money supply. People don't realize that actually wasn't part of the original design of the Fed. And this required a vibrant investment market for the federal government's debt. Again, this was anathema to the Fed's founders. So critics went ballistic between 1932 and 1935, when a series of emergency legislation, the two Glass-Steagall bills, the Banking Acts of 33 and 35, and the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 are probably the most important. When these acts cemented T-bills' role in Fed operations, centralized the Fed's authority in Washington, D.C., and nullified the domestic gold standard. Already in 1934, the editors of Fortune magazine declared that, quote, the revolution had come to the credit system. And that year, a writer for a literary journal insisted, quote, financial news no longer originates in Wall Street. Roosevelt's budget director described the bank's new reliance upon government bonds as, quote, the end of Western civilization. He soon resigned from office. And economist Henry Park Willis, who was the co-author of the original Federal Reserve Act, he told Congress in 1935 that Roosevelt's reforms were practically suicide for the financial system. So it's a really wide-ranging debate among these kind of experts that I cover in the piece. Now, of course, these critics lost the era's battles over both public policy and economic ideas. And they lost to officials and academics who found common cause in a theory of money that challenged one of the Fed's foundational principles. Now, both that larger debate and its resolution are nicely captured in a swift reinvention. We're thinking about language and its role in shaping banking practice. In a swift reinvention of ideas about treasury securities. The Fed had been designed on so-called real bills principles. That argues that banks should only lend against the promise of future commercial activity. The real bill was an IOU promising revenues set from, say, the sale of an inventory or a future crop. And for this reason, federal securities were not seen as attractive, nor as particularly liquid investments. Lawrence Chamberlain wrote in 1912 in an industry standard manual for security traders, quote, nothing but unfamiliarity with investment principles is an excuse for private buying of United States bonds. It's 1912. Jump ahead to 1930s, and the defenders of financial reform were rejecting real bills theory. They were reasserting the so-called quantity theory of monetary management, and they were viewing treasury bonds as investment grade. By 1936, the standard study of Fed practices by Randolph Burgess described T-bills as, quote, safer and more liquid than even the best quality commercial paper. So along with other defenders of reform, Burgess insisted that the type of collateral backing monetary issue was largely incidental, that it need not be tied to commercial activity per se, because the central bank's primary task was managing the currency's supply. And so federal reform had not revolutionized American finance, people like this argued, but instead defined clear-cut public responsibilities that pose no threat to capitalist markets. Again, today most scholars agree, describing Depression-era financial policies as prudent and conservative measures that stabilized the banking sector and insulated Americans against some of capitalism's unpredictability without distorting the market's natural generative powers. Meanwhile, scholars explain how economic knowledge gradually caught up with the facts on the ground as monetary authorities, politicians, and economists gained new insights into money and markets. The fact that scholars continue to embrace monetary orthodoxy is the third subject of this essay and of this project. And I argue that orthodoxy's hegemony is deeply indebted to the politics of crisis management in the 1930s. Many of us are aware that the orthodox or neoclassical view of money has rejected and largely sidelined most heterodox critiques since the 1940s. I'm here referring to chartalist, post-Keynesian, constitutional theory of money, circuit theory, etc. And I'm suggesting that the clay was initially baked for this rejection in the 1930s when policymakers and economists embraced the quantity model because the politics of financial crisis demanded it. Our modern financial system and the rise of an orthodox consensus about money, I'm arguing, share a political origin story. This is in part an intellectual history because in the 1930s, the marginal revolution had come to the rescue of federal officials and bankers. By then, Irving Fisher had helped re-articulate and further validate quantity theory by reconciling it with the language and logic of general equilibrium. And now a prominent advocate of this view, Lachlan Curry, also had the ear of New Deal officials. In 1934, he published The Supply and Control of Money in the United States, a book which combined a rebuttal of real bills theory with a defense of the government's expansive new powers, and thus articulated some core premises of the orthodoxy that would soon come to dominate. Central to that orthodoxy and to Curry's argument is a very narrow definition of money. He draws a stark distinction between two categories of financial instruments: true money forms, which he says permit people to buy things, and second, instruments that represent a promise of future payments. He's basically, in his words, he distinguishes between means of payment, on the one hand, and what might be regarded as equivalent to means of payment. Or put simply, he's offering a social scientific vocabulary for distinguishing money from credit. The first is limited to bank paper and demand deposits, and the second describes pretty much all other financial assets. True money, he argues, enabled people to make purchases, while all those equivalents enabled them to hold wealth and plan for future monetary exchanges. And this new iteration of quantity theory validated a really appealing political narrative in the 1930s, because it described, alternatively, a sector of American finance over which the state had come to exercise considerable authority since World War I, and another to which it remained pretty much a bystander. Monetary authorities had gained significant new powers to influence the creation of paper currency and checking deposits. By contrast, they still had minimal direct influence on people's decisions to save or the creation of private credit forms. And by this logic, that history of the asset and political revolution, which I described before, only altered the mechanics of market exchange. That is, people's ability to buy and sell things. It enabled authorities to adjust the amount of money tokens in circulation, but it did not shape the creation of the money equivalents, and with it, people's economic choices. So he assured economists and policymakers alike that despite all this change, the market's dynamism remained secure in the private sector and free from government interference. So in simplest terms, Curry refuted scientifically the real Bill's view that monetary expansion needed to be grounded in an expectation of any specific wealth-creating activity. And by doing so, he helped codify the belief that money creation has no direct relationship to the productive process. Meanwhile, he helped actually write this theory literally into the American financial system. He was recruited away from Harvard, but into the Treasury in 1934, and he convinced Roosevelt and Eccles to expand permanently the types of eligible paper for rediscount, and then he basically drafted major portions of the Banking Act of 1935 along these principles. So here in the back in 1935, I see kind of the legislative culmination of this policy and asset revolution, when they gave the state unprecedented authority over money and made a trade in T-bills an integral component of the financial system. So by the 1940s, real bills was almost universally rejected by professional economists, and the standard narrative about the Fed's mandate had been revised, this is really telling, in light of this new consensus thinking. I mentioned the text by Randolph Burgess. Books like that, written in the 30s and 40s, document these shifts in both policy and in intellectual fashion. And tellingly, Burgess felt the need to explain himself. He wrote in the edit, he actually published his first thing in the late 20s on Real Bill's Principles, republished it in 36, and changed the rules, and then explained, it has indeed been necessary to change some ideas formerly held, especially as to the nature of the collateral for note issues. Why? Because central bankers had learned that the key to assuring the money supply's elasticity was not the specific type of collateral held, but rather the mechanism by which the notes are issued. So in other words, what he was saying was that bankers and economists figured out that the Fed's designers had followed principles that turned out to be wrong because of their misconceptions about the nature of monetary issue, and since then, we figured it out and we're on the right track. These assumptions about money and central banking have since dominated academic and policy discussions in the US. Scholars portray true money narrowly as an instrument that captures existing private sector wealth, and by doing so facilitates exchange. Meanwhile, they depict credit forms as contracts that afford people and institutions temporal flexibility in their spending choices. And with these two components of finance separated, again, the exchange function and the contractual function, with those separated for the purposes of analysis, scholars describe the most important monetary variable in very narrow terms, namely the quantity of Federal Reserve notes and checkbook money in circulation. The source of money's creation, the conditions under which it's produced, and who or what collateralizes it has become largely insignificant. Now I'm wrapping up here. Of course, heterodox work on money demonstrates that orthodoxy invokes a mythical history of money. Money and debt are not separable and have never performed wholly distinct functions. Rather, modern money forms evolved from credit instruments and continue to do the work of contracts. They're economically productive, essential to the negotiations between creditors and debtors. Given this fact, Depression-era reform looks very different. When the federal state gained new means of collateralizing money creation and simultaneously guaranteed the currency's domestic value, it gained unprecedented power to finance economic growth. And I'm arguing here that this story has been erased from political and academic discourse in no small measure because the politics of reform demanded it. In the 1930s, economists joined politicians in attributing the Depression's endurance to a liquidity crisis sparked by a collapse of confidence. They reaffirmed orthodox assumptions about liquidity, that it represents the ease of turning assets into cash, and about money, again, that its primary role is to facilitate exchange. And these experts revised the working definition of sound assets for monetary management, claiming that the change was prompted by advancements in their understanding of money. And again, most accounts of early 20th century financial history repeat this story. They argue that American monetary authorities were slow to recognize their responsibility for stabilizing the money supply because of their misconceptions about money. They portray the ascendance of monetary orthodoxy as a triumph of economic science, not a product of politics and reform itself. But I'm arguing here, orthodoxy's triumph was in no small part a function of the state's response to an economic crisis. The conventional wisdom about money changed in this era and quickly marginalized a young chartalist critique and a number of important critiques that have developed since then, because orthodoxy told a story that many people wanted to hear. And of course, since then, that orthodoxy has long appealed to experts anxious to reconcile the state's integral role in finance, in other words, money's real history, with their political desire to describe money as little more than a tool or mechanism that complements an equilibrium-seeking free market. Thanks.
Thank you all for being here. I promise you the microphone. Oh, of course. Hello. Good. So thank you all for being here. I promise I'm going to be very brief since this is the end of a long conference, and I don't have that much to say. But I'm going to and leave a lot of time for the Q&A, hopefully. So I'm going to start with a quote from Christine de Sand's opening remarks when she said that money is not inherently democratic, but it needs to be made so. She also said, quote, "Today's challenge is to revise the monetary architecture we have inherited so that it operates to reinforce democratic aspirations rather than undermine them." I think that an integral part of the monetary setup we have inherited is the character of the relation between money issuer and money users. In order to better understand what exactly it is that we have inherited and understand what is specific about it today, I will attempt to illuminate the character of the relation between money issuer and money users, and do so historically. Unwittingly, I have written a paper that complements David's paper. He writes about intellectual and policy history, whereas I look much more at social history. Unwittingly also, I have written a response paper to the first presenter of this conference, Anushka Padia, but I don't focus on the legitimacy bestowed by an abstract people on the government, but on the historically specific relation between issuer and user, actual people in flesh and blood who depend on accessing money and feel more or less powerless in relation to the money issuer. Finally, the focus on the relation between issuers and users can help two questions that have come up repeatedly in different panels in relation to progressive social change. First, the question of popular ignorance relative to money creation. Things like the fact that public and private debt are not the same, how banks create money, etc. And the second question is that many people have asked, can money even be democratic? Is it possible to think of money as a democratic medium? I'm going to be very brief. I'm going to first offer a set of concepts that I have found useful to think through that relation between money issuer and money users, and then offer a brief historical narrative to show how this relation has changed very dramatically. First, on a conceptual level, I build on the historian E.P. Thompson's moral economy approach. The moral economy perspective highlights popular visions of different parties, of how different parties relate to the economy. So what different parties think they have a right to receive from the political social order and what they should give in return. In the process of provisioning human bodies with the goods and services they need, moral economies are compelling enough to inspire direct action. They make the laws on the books seem flimsy, their decency doubtful, and the use of state violence in their defense an affront to human rights. Moral economists of money emphasize that money is not a neutral background for individual exchange. They argue instead that money is at the service of specific political projects, evaluating money by asking if its institutionalization furthers the social order they desire, grounded in rights and duties they consider just. Animated by a moral economy, colonial North American and subsequent US publics, most of which were dominated by white men, debated the following questions. Who should be allowed to create money, for what purpose? How should the community deal with inflation? Who, if anyone, should be allowed to profit from money creation? So money was not neutral in those times, in the 18th century, the 19th century, but I'm going to argue all the way up to the New Deal. Because they highlight that money is a creature of government, moral economists also challenge the idea that public authorities depend on a supply of money from private actors to finance public endeavors. So the moral economy approach is very distinct from the government-society relation proposed in the conference's opening talk yesterday. I'm not talking about abstract legitimacy or some sort of implicit popular consent, but about the historically specific ways in which money users articulate their rights in relation to money issuing public authorities. A moral economic vision enables money users to articulate exactly their demands. Moral economic pressure does not necessarily transform the mode of issue, but it can nudge governmental actors to change policies to preserve existing positions of power, as I will show below. Historically, moral economists were primarily white men, but especially in the period from the Civil War to the Great Depression, white women participated in moral economic monetary practices, and after Reconstruction, African Americans built distinct movements that entered alliances with lower class whites in the same area, for instance in Virginia. So that nicely complements Mirza Baradwaran's talk, who focuses on black banks, but there were also attempts to mobilize money as a public good after Reconstruction. Abortive attempts, but they exist nevertheless, and they point to the possibility of inclusive moral economies. But no moral economy is without detractors who argue that money is a neutral device that ought to be outside of politics and institutionalized according to market logic. From the perspective of moral economy, references to the market presented as money's natural habitat and source are a mask worn by particular interests, that's a quote from Thompson, that obscures the power relations and interests that make up the existing arrangements. This paper is not, just a brief note, this paper is not about symbolic violence, but I want to note that when detractors of moral economy prevail, there is, I would say that there's something like monetary silence in place, that populations cannot articulate their relation to the money user. Monetary silence, I would say, has racist, sexist, and classist effects because it supports meritocratic myth that disproportionately benefit white men. So those with money can feel validated by monetary silence, as having money, the seemingly neutral indicator of worth, suggests that one has done useful work, while lack of money shows that one has not. Therefore, monetary silence and the idea that money is neutral amount to institutionalized symbolic violence that targets those who have less, disproportionately members of racialized groups and women. As the critical economist Anne Jennings said, We uphold money's neutrality, centrality in creating hierarchies precisely by denying that it matters. So I'm going to suggest that the relative strength of moral economists and their detractors is key for understanding the changing relation between money users and money issuer. If the detractors are successful, they manage to stabilize what I call monetary silence. Vice versa, if moral economists are successful, populations become more empowered. So I'm now going to turn from the conceptual level to the historical level, and I'm going to again be very brief and mark a slight departure from the typical narratives which end popular money in politics in 1896 or with the creation of the Fed. I'm going to suggest that it happened counterintuitively during the New Deal. Most people in this room are familiar with 18th and 19th century stories of politicization. So that's why I'm going to focus on the story that ends in the New Deal. In the first years of the Great Depression, key popular actors made rights claims connected to claims about what money is. And that was systematic. Typically, historians deal with veteran politics, debates about veterans' pays, about pensions, and the Townsend movement, agricultural credit, just prices, all different separate social movements. Historians deal with them separately. What I'm doing is I'm bringing those together, and what I'm noticing is that they all have a way of articulating their demands relative to monetary institutions. They all mobilize different moral economies of money. So that it's true for veterans, it's true for Milo Reno's Farm Holiday Association, but also people on the right, like Father Coughlin, the Townsend movement. There were also scrip issues in different city municipalities. These moral economies translated into strong pressure on Congress, but also into direct action, most famously the Bonus March, where thousands of veterans camped in front of Congress and demanded greenbacks to pay what they claimed the government owed them. In response to those moral economists, FDR did several things. He never explicitly opposed them until 1936, but he used the pressure that they generated in his favor when it suited him, but he never, while always trying to discourage the reemergence of moral economies. That's especially notable in three contexts: the emergency banking legislation of 1933, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and also the veterans bonus. In all three cases, there were strong congressional blocs, in some cases veto-proof majorities, that were bent on mandating greenbacks. And he actually received, in the Thomas Amendment to the Agricultural Adjustment Act, FDR received the authority to issue greenbacks, which he never used, in a last-ditch effort to prevent veto-proof congressional majority from going back to Civil War practices. He also pioneered a public discourse in which gold was no longer central, but money became a neutral background nevertheless. At the same time, the New Deal established and legitimized the idea of socio-economic rights, primarily for white men, but these rights became disconnected from the question of institutional control, which had until then been an integral part of the political economic imaginary of white male Americans. That they have the right to participate in shaping their conditions of socio-economic life. I'm building here on the work of Aziz Rahman especially. So the rights claims became separate from institutional control after the New Deal, and we can see that in different moments. We can see that in the community reinvestment movement, in the feminist mobilization for credit access, where different groups, non-white males, attempted to gain the kinds of rights that white men had received during the New Deal, but without mobilizing the kind of moral economic pressure that white men had used during and before the New Deal. So rights claims become disconnected from money's moral economy. From a more monetary perspective then, and I'm not going to say very much about neoliberalism in the interest of time, all I'm going to say is that from a monetary perspective, the relation between the New Deal and neoliberalism is more than a simple opposition or succession. Instead of rejecting it wholesale, neoliberals selectively draw on the New Deal legacy, dismantling forms of access to rights, dismantling the idea that of socioeconomic rights, while building on the absence of popular participation and moral economy. So if resistance to gold standard-induced austerity enabled Depression-era groups like veterans to connect their demands to the monetary system, today's demands for public spending are typically disconnected from that context. So from the perspective of popular involvement in money, from the perspective of moral economy, the current situation is unprecedented in US history. New Deal of modes of access are under attack, but institutionalist popular knowledge is gone. I'm also going to talk really briefly about Occupy Wall Street, and I'm going to claim, I'm just going to give you a very brief snippet and end on that note. I have a detailed analysis in the paper, which I'm happy to share. And I claim that the movement did not break with post-New Deal monetary silence. I'm going to focus on $350. Those were $350 in bitcoins donated to the movement in 2011. Bitcoin is the currency of a tech-driven movement that celebrates the idea that money is privately created and can exist outside of public institutions, a practice people like Ron Paul endorse and celebrate. The connection between Bitcoin and Occupy Wall Street is important not because of the small amount involved. It's important because public acceptance of the money is a performative act that can contribute to its status. The apparent absence of activist protest against accepting Bitcoin and the reported proximity of parts of the Bitcoin community to Occupy, which is a currency that embodies a far-reaching denial of money's public purpose, also indicates Occupy Wall Street's distance from Depression-era activists. It's the equivalent of Depression-era farmers or veterans advocating, or even pension activists, advocating privately created money to fight unemployment and deflation, which is unthinkable. In the Great Recession's public imaginary, Bitcoins have largely taken the space of the public scrip experiments during the Great Depression. Experiments that reinforced, rather than undermined, the idea that money is a public good. David Columbia writes that Bitcoin's real utility and purpose can be understood as a program for recruiting uninformed citizens into a neoliberal political discourse. It's also, from my perspective, a program for recruiting them into monetary silence, the absence of an empowering institutionalist relation with the money-issuing sovereign. Occupy, I think, did not fully break with monetary silence, but some of the critical institutionalist work that we've seen in this conference, especially MMT, offer important building blocks for a contemporary moral economy. To return to the quote from Design's opening remarks I started with, that money is not inherently democratic, but it needs to be made so. I think in order to make it more democratic, it's important to critically reconnect with the moral economies of the past, not out of nostalgia or to idealize them, but to recognize that monetary silence is a historical outcome that can be undone. Thank you.
All right, thank you guys very much. Now I'm going to open the floor to questions.
I have a question of David, and I'm just sort of thinking about this. So here's my question. So general equilibrium theory is premised on the existence of Clarke. That's what gets you to general equilibrium, because nobody wants to hold on to money for its own sake. Now, I'm trying to figure this out now. So when the real bills doctrine was debunked, or it was got rid of, and it was replaced with this other view of money, and that, as I understood from what you were saying, then led to this notion that the government controls the supply of money. I mean, the central bank does, right? Is that then? I mean, consistent also with reaffirming the general equilibrium view, that in fact it's that it's not a monetary system fundamentally, but it can be, basically the central bank has its own discretionary power to determine how much money would be entering into the system, and thereby you get this sort of technocratic view
Yes.
about the central bank. Am I on the right track over here?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things I'm trying to reconstruct here is that, I mean, that premise, the quantity theory premise is hundreds of years old. It's been explored for a long, long time. But what the leaders of the marginal revolution did was create this model of an aggregate of individuals, an early version of market planning. It's really interesting because they weren't as hardcore sort of monetarists as they've later been invoked to be. They actually have appreciated institutions. But anyway, they set those rules. What Irving Fisher and a handful of other people did was sort of create, and they emphasized sort of what became mathematical modeling of this. And what Fisher did was reconcile the two and create a way for them to justify the price index and basically watching prices to determine how much money needs to be circulating. So what they did, it all started to converge. What I'm trying to capture is the way that those traditions converge in the 20s and 30s. Another big part of this is there's a battle among economists, among and between institutional economists and these people who are sort of pursuing versions of general equilibrium theory. They come to a head in the 30s and 40s. And what I'm saying, so the short answer to your question is yes. And what I'm saying here is that the politics of the moment gave them a really big boost because it made that model, it helped to give that model considerable traction in policy circles, especially and ultimately among economists who wanted to hold on to the general equilibrium model, but kind of erase this revolution in state power that we're witnessing at the same time.
Farley?
Comment,
I'll keep a list, sorry, so anyone wants to raise their hand, I'll put you down.
Comment question for Nathan. So states have the power to charter corporations.
Yes.
But the question is, does the actions of corporations, are they bound then by the constitutional restrictions on states? Now, there's nothing initially that says anything about that, so it's a very fuzzy, interesting question. And it probably would depend on how cozy the corporation is with the state. They give you
with the Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, I'll give you a brief example. The states are not allowed to engage in treaties with foreign powers, right? They can't do that constitutionally. But suppose I charter a corporation and it's all private, but they go out and they trade with a foreign country. That's an agreement, that's a treaty. We would say, no, that's not unconstitutional. But suppose the state charters a corporation, a trade corporation, and they own 50% of the shares, and they place their own guy there, and they order this corporation to go make a trade treaty with Spain. We'd probably say that's unconstitutional. In the banking sector, there was a couple examples like that early on where states chartered state banks and the relationship is really cozy. The bank is basically the state's lender. In that case, that may be very different than just the general chartering of state banks. So,
yeah, so there's a few things there. One is the whole issue of, which is a more general issue, person to look for work is Hackett and Omarova. There's a whole debate in this period of what actually a chartering of a corporation is. So that's the whole. So specifically on that issue, there is, forgetting who it is, but it's a Supreme Court case with Dartmouth in 1819. Before that, the general perception was basically like a charter of a corporation was a chartered corporation was serving some sort of public purpose, and having private shareholders was just something incidental to that process. Just like we just happens to be useful to have these kind of partnerships to do these activities, but this is still a public entity. Dartmouth basically reversed that. Basically makes it private ownership is private ownership even if there's charter. Nonetheless, what I think is but banking is still distinct relative to that relation, which is Omarova and Hackett's paper argues. But in a very more specific way than they do, what I would say is obviously as my whole presentation is about, it's about what meaning a bill of credit you use. But even if you conceive of the corporation broadly being, private or based on private actors, the ability to emit the bill of credit is a public power, and I see what you're saying with the thing about the thing. I mean, obviously, homonyms everywhere. The thing is about what is the definition of treaty in your example. What I think is distinguishing is the definition of treaty doesn't necessarily hold for private actors. It's by definition a sovereign entity that is doing it, or have an entity with some sort of sovereignty is doing it. Whereas the legal definition of a bill of credit, I think, under one conception of a bill of credit, holds even if that power is being delegated, franchised out to a private actor. And it's that power and the tax receivability backing that is being transferred. And I think that Story recognizes this, because I think he's one of the most sophisticated commentators and thinkers on this issue. And what I think the reason he's staking out his issue, that it's the value of bill of credit is purely based on founded on private capital, even though that's clearly nonsense, is he recognizes that if you go with the legal meaning, the receivability meaning of bills of credit, then the delegation of this power has to be unconstitutional.
I think one of the things you got to do is just really drive the distinction between how they're using these bills of credit and what would be a private promissory note or a corporate bond or something like that that's different, and really highlight that difference, and then say, look.
Yeah, I mean, this is, so what you're hitting on is my broader project is, as I think you know, in the secondary literature, there's no documentation of what is the tax receivability structure at the state level. So my project is going through, which is why it's a huge project, is going through each state and getting the tax receivability laws and this tax structure for each state. So I'm 11 states in, and I'm going through 33 states. And so this is why this is a preview of that much larger project, but that much larger project is what I'm relying on to be able to definitively make the distinction between those two instruments.
The gentleman in the back, and then Ann.
Yeah, two things. Nathan, I was actually going to come up and actually hand it to you, but it must have fallen out of my wallet. Do you know what a sales tax token is?
Yes, I've seen those before. I don't remember exactly the dates, but they're generally 1930s, 1940s.
Yeah, they also go back to 1914. So it seems that, so if 12 states issued them, and so basically, for those who don't know, is that when you would buy something under a penny and you had to pay sales tax, they started collecting sales tax, you would get this token. Now this token actually, I don't know how they went into circulation, but it seems exactly what you're talking about, the bill of credit, because it's basically a public good that's due, because then if I wanted to go pay my sales tax, I'm paying it with this sales token that I get from the merchant. And so it basically circulates exactly kind of what you're saying, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is I'm starting at the beginning, but where I'm looking is to do that out for later on. I mean, it's not just the sales tokens, it's also, there's depression ship in general. And some of them is stamp money, which was actually a Irving Fisher proposal, but there's other structures where they're actually tax receivable. Detroit has a essentially complementary currency, as it were, that's receivable in payment of taxes to the city of Detroit. And what they write on it is very strange. They have a thing written similar to like the legal tender, but it's obviously not legal tender. They're basically trying to, as much as possible, say it is nothing like any money thing that's on it, but nonetheless, it's still acceptable in payment of taxes and at the city level. What the story later on is, these cases ruling which bends the meaning of bill of credit, because we're in a precedent legal system, aggressively narrow the meaning of the legal meaning of what a bill of credit is, and make it such that the fact that a municipality is like essentially a chartered corporation of the state. But even, if a state bank that's issuing bills of credit that's completely owned by the state isn't violating the bill of credit exemption because it's a separate chartered corporation, then the separate chartered corporation of a municipality, which has its own distinct authority, is going to even more not violate that. So essentially, there's many ongoing consequences, but one narrow ongoing legal consequence of trying to make antebellum American money constitutional is that complementary currencies essentially become constitutional and become periodically a response to crises in the United States.
Yeah, sure.
So, something that might inform all of y'all papers, but in particular Jacob and David, is in the gold cases, there were 4 gold cases when FDR was trying to pack the Supreme Court. The final gold case in that Supreme Court decision in the dissent, basically a person loaned gold, a certain amount of gold to the government, and they were supposed to pay back X number of ounces of gold plus additional ounces for interest. And the government said, no, we're going to take that gold and we're just going to give you basically these crisp dollar bills in exchange. And the person said, no, I want my gold. And so the court ruled against them 5-4 because FDR was threatening to pack the court. In the dissent, you may want to read those dissents, but the dissent said that once you do this, this is the end of private property because this person has said, I'm giving you this to loan you property. You know, I'm giving you gold, and I want gold back. And so basically, it was the end of private property, and that is what the dissent said. And it has some really good language that you may want to quote.
Thank you. That's great.
Anne?
Hi. This is also a question for Nathan. It's a really interesting paper and a lot of food for thought here. But I also really want to encourage you to take the Briscoe case a little bit more at face value and spend a little bit more time thinking about some of the various definitions of bills of credit that were actually active during this time, and maybe anchored a little bit more in some of the politics of the time. Because in particular, I'm having a hard time kind of reconciling some of this with the fact that this is the tawny court. And these are really hard money justices. And so I see that there's like a lot of focus on these bills being available as payment of taxes. But what I see is that they're also equally concerned with whether or not they're backed by the state. In other words, is the state actually responsible for paying these bills? And that's actually not necessarily guaranteed by these charters. It depends on which state you're in. And so I would just be really interested to hear kind of like, one, how you reconcile the two, and then second, I would suggest that actually one place that you should look is some of the repudiation of state debts that happens in 1838, 1839 around Mississippi, because that seems to me to be exactly what they're debating. Should a state actually be liable for accepting these bills, either as payment of taxes or for paying bonds that back them? And the answer is no. And then this is a sort of side question, but what is happening with tax receipts in states that outlawed banks and their constitutions? What are they using?
Good questions. So, obviously, my presentation was very cursory. I mean, I sort of just wanted to hit all the highlights to get you up to speed to have the discussion of the Supreme Court cases I had to run through, largely Professor Grubb's work, and kind of move that along. So obviously, the discussion is very abbreviated, and what I said in advance, which is a work in progress, I said to Edwards, is a very brief, kind of very cursory discussion. What I would, in the full fleshed out paper, what I'm going to be spending a lot more time on is kind of the slower evolution of this conception. Because I absolutely agree the conception of bill of credit becomes, there's two things. One is it becomes contested, and the other, the historical memory changes. It's different talking about these issues in 1803 than talking about them in the 1830s. It's a whole different generation of people. I think that nonetheless, and this is kind of goes more into some other work, there's a good legal historian who actually wrote a biography of Joseph Story, Dunn, who also wrote a book, Monetary Decisions of the Supreme Court, has a paper on Joseph Story and American law banking. There's just one piece of where I'm getting, he really had this belief on constitutionally on this basis. But where I would go is precisely what you're going, is that all these distinctions of the technicality of the receivability structure, the fact that, you know, once you move from the early banks that in part what Professor Grubb was talking about in his comment, where receivability was unconditional, and going to conditional receivability based on whether they were current, paying out gold and silver. that's a legal argument that in the paper I'm going to have to contend with as something that distinguishes it from a bill of credit. It is, so for example, an argument you can make is that the legal definition of bill of credit implicitly in the colonial era is unconditional receivability and payment of taxes. Well, first of all, it would make a lot of those early banks also unconstitutional, but two, I need to develop it in the paper, but I don't think that's satisfactory in terms of countering the older conception. But of course, your broader point is correct that in the paper itself, I'm going to have a much more detailed discussion of all these court cases and the nuances of them. And remind me a little bit the second piece.
States that outlaw banks in their constitution.
State outlaw banks. It's so I'm still in the progress of going through that, but part of it is a lot of the states that ban state banks in their state constitutions are places where they're entering the union later on, and so sometimes that means they have a holdover of territorial bills of credit that are still circulating. Because the Constitution bans states issuing bills of credit. It doesn't ban territories from issuing bills of credit, and it's a combination of that and then kind of just already not necessarily being monetized economies yet that that they're using people's private IOUs, use stored credit, book credit, and then there's circulation of bank in the United States. So for ones that are in the earlier era and later era, there's other kind of federally circulated stuff, but that also needs to be. I'm going chronologically, so those are the last ones. Now I've done some cursory research, but it's the ones that I have least decided. Although I know Texas is likely one, but they also had redbacks.
The gentleman over here at the table.
Hi. Just a very simple question. So, in terms of the moral economics, the discussion benefit the public. So you mentioned you use E.P. Thompson's theory. Based on this, but he was writing about the UK, the classical struggle, the evolving of the working class of the British society. So how do you incorporate that concept into your research?
Okay, so I changed it a little bit because in the U.S. context, it becomes in the context that E.P. Thompson looks at. He looked at societies that are not formally democratic. So he tries to look at how crowds can try to control their notables or their political officials through popular moral economic pressure, right? I have adapted that framework, and other people have done that before me, to places where, for a segment of the population, electoral processes are actually important. So there's a person named Bogan, the first name just escapes me, who has adapted that, and I draw on her. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay, yeah.
Sir?
Yeah, thank you, panel, for the discussion. Especially Jacob, I want to take you for reminding me, and I can quote everybody else, on the focus of the conference, which was, of course, money as a democratic medium, and then asking the question, is money a democratic medium? I think you would agree with Christine in the beginning, keynote speaker, or the introduction, that it's not at this time. And then my research has got me a belief system that since money now is a debt, it's issued as debt, why not just issue it as credit? For example, a homeowner, and this is getting a little far-fetched, I suppose, instead of paying the money back with interest, just pays the buyer, or the seller of the house, or constructs the house, and the money dissipates in society. So in the aggregate, the money never is inflationary because it's stable. The use of the money goes to the circulation of the money, and it never comes out. And the borrowing always has to happen in our current system to keep people in the inflationary spiral, right? Because when you're in the aggregate, when money is borrowed, it increases the money supply, right?
Right.
So in aggregate, yeah, so if it's issued as debt, you have to pay it back, and when you pay it back, basically it's supposed to be distinguishing the money, and that creates competition, more and more competition.
Right.
So the idea is to issue money as credit. And I think that's the simple, from my point of view, that's a simple answer. A little far-fetched, but it's just what it is.
Okay, so I come from a charterist credit theory perspective. So I think that all money is always necessarily credit in order to be money. So I'm not
money. We can argue, but money is debt. Every dollar that's issued is debt. It has to be paid back. It's an IOU. It's not really money. It operates as money in the system, but it's really just debt.
Right. But
it's an IOU, rather. I mean, it's an IOU.
Exactly. From a charterist perspective, all money is necessarily debt. Right.
James?
Jacob, I was intrigued by that final comment about the 350 bitcoins and the appropriation of at least part of the Occupy Wall Street by this libertarian framework. And I was thinking to myself that, that's not actually inconsistent with where you started with the whole E.E. Thompson, right? I'm thinking about his book, The Black Act. I don't know if you're familiar with that book. And yeah, that's a really good book, the Whigs, but anyway, I won't go into the book. But the basic point is that you have these political movements among forest dwellers going on for centuries in England, it's about cutting down the trees. But anyway, the fact is that the populist movements that arose in response to specific things that the state was doing, right? They could take many different political shapes. And I think this was a point that some of us that brought up yesterday, right? Which is that the politics of money and the politics of inequality don't have to necessarily imply that it's good politics. It could be also fascist politics, right? And I think that would be quite in line with this sort of mobilization around discontent. But part of it is taken over by this sort of hard right libertarian viewpoint, which kind of is an uneasy bedmate with the left, right?
Right. So for me, the libertarians and the Bitcoin they're not even bedmates. Right. It's not that they're uneasy because I don't see them as embodying a moral economy. I see them as engaged in the project of denying.
But I'm just saying that in terms of the response to the crisis and inequality, and that you've got these libertarian types arguing that we need more money, in response to dealing with a corrupt state, right? I mean, in that sense, that they're adopting in some sense the language that the left uses too, that there's a corrupt state, and that's what I meant.
Absolutely, yeah, totally.
The back.
Thank you. Thanks for these very interesting talks on American history. I don't know much about it, but I would like to know from your, and especially David, point, from your looking through the history, and at the end you said what we look at in heterodoxy. Now we have to go back to the history to understand the current debates. Do you see appetite for the real bill theory again, or any people trying to get the central bank to go back to more real collateral?
Yes and no. Thankfully, real bills in its pure form has not had a resurgence. Real bills, I'm still trying to get my head on it. It was never really codified. It was sort of the popular view among bankers. And I'm interested in it not because I think they were right, but because they were focused on one thing about money that is absolutely right, which is that its issue is necessary and productive. I'm interested in, and we're several people floating around here are interested in a sort of a neo-chartalist view, and here's where the enthusiasm and interest is. The people who are doing sort of neo-chartalist, a variety of post-Keynesian, and some constitutional theories of money are arguing that if we look at the history of money, we find that its issue is actually necessary. It's the issuance of credit. and it's absolutely essential to the productive process. So the reason I'm interested in real bills is because that was for kind of almost as a historical accident, they were kind of focused on commercial credit because that was kind of the old school of banking. It turns out that commercial bills weren't even that, they were decreasing in importance even by the time the Fed was created, but the Fed founders didn't know that because they were so enamored with this idea. And because they were focused on that, they were very sensitive to the fact that the government was assuming a whole new kind of menu of authority that would sustain and protect the issuance of money that was backed by federal debt. They sort of, it's around the same time that early chartalist writing was actually coming out, and it wasn't until really the 30s, 40s, and 50s that it started to be articulated. And one of the components of chartalist thinking, which I think is really important, and it's a fundamental challenge to that economic orthodoxy, is that money is endogenous to the economy. You actually have to the issue of money is central to the creation of wealth and the exchange that comes with it. And what orthodoxy has done is excised endogenous money. I think they did it in large part because of a series of both political challenges and structural changes in the economy in the late 19th and early 20th century. So what I've sort of stumbled upon here, I think, is a kind of accidental history of not an accidental history, a history of dissent, which uncovers something which has been masked and has prevented people from exploring these really rich heterodox traditions. I think the heterodox stuff on money is right. I'm an historian. I came at this as an historian, not as an economist. I wrote a book about debt markets for housing, actually about the FHA, all the stuff she was talking about before. And I was really struck that all the economists I was reading claimed that the government insuring a mortgage loan was not wealth creating. And I just didn't understand that. So I became a student of how economists understand credit allocation and its relationship to money. I was already a historian of New Deal policies, and the rest is this history. So yeah, the short answer is yes, there is some very exciting, both intellectual and linked to policy developments. Unfortunately, we are competing with the panel on the job guarantee. That's kind of the focus of it, actually. They're not real bills, and that's fine. Real bills were but what real bills had was they were invested in a loose idea of an asset theory of money, and their idea of assets were these assets have to be productive. They were really torn on the relationship between monetary issue and production, and I'm actually still trying to parse that out. But they highlight historically the fact that people were really up in arms, that basically the collateral that was backing monetary issue was changing radically, and that really mattered. And what orthodoxy provided was a perfect vocabulary, or this rearticulation of orthodoxy, which is both economic theory and political actors coming together, articulated a perfect kind of solution to mask that fact. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I've got Farley and the gentleman in the sweater. Farley first.
Again for Nathan, I don't know if you've run across this way of thinking about bills of credit, but you go to 1756 statutory law in Virginia, they say that treasury notes and bills of credit are the same thing. So we took that seriously, we might say, well, treasury notes are unconstitutional too. But you have to But the key thing here is that they're using bills of credit and treasury notes to directly pay for things, as opposed to, say, a state bond where you sell a bond for, say, gold and silver and then buy what you want. And then when you redeem the bond, you're going to pay back gold and silver. Where here, a bill of credit or a treasury note is, one of the distinctions is, I'm going to directly use this to pay for something.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is another thing that you can focus on is emission. What actually is emission? Is emission just the issuance? I sold it to someone and then I used the revenue to buy stuff, or is emission specifically the payment to a direct payment to someone?
Right, and that's the payment side as opposed to the tax redemption side. I think both of those.
I think ultimately what I'll say in the paper is that, like, every word in the sentence is a homonym, and there's also, I mean, part of this is just a more kind of, which, old hat to critical legal theory people, is that, when you're using all these terms of art at once, there's so many different angles you can approach the terms of art to get the result that is in a realist sense necessary because we're not going to destroy the banking system. And I think that's part of what's interesting about it is it's a nice concrete example of that sort of hominem process in, because I would say the same thing about the ECB cases today. I mean, there's all sorts of different homonyms in the Maastricht Treaty that they can play with to get the technical legal result that they need, which is everything the ECB does is fine and dandy. But the broader, the original concept of what was the economic motivations behind having that in the Maastricht Treaty is completely obliterated by outright monetary transactions. And the other aspect, which I didn't really get into, is that when banks are such a huge source of funding for the states themselves, they have a lot of states have these big taxes on capital. I mean, there's work like Michael Bordeaux and other people on that kind of thing. Like substantively, this is going around the spirit, even if it's a little more indirect. It's going around the whole spirit of that conception of we're going to do it from one angle. Or another more cynical angle, you might go, this kind of game is fine and dandy as long as it's in the control of these technocratic actors who are bankers, and the technocratic aspect of it is what insulates it from the yahoos about banging on the door, who will use this for some sort of more libertarian or democratic finance project. So I mean, I didn't emphasize it as much here because you're just trying to run through it quickly. But yeah, I mean, the whole sentence is a homonym that is just everything is a homonym that you can construct the meaning that you want out of it.
Sir?
Yeah, so I want to draw on Jean-May's comment in relation to Jakob's paper. I think the juxtaposition between Father Coughlin and then the Bitcoin, like David Colombia's identification of Bitcoin as a neoliberal ideological project, sort of puts into relief the ways in which the monetary silencing through that Jakob identifies from the New Deal onward still applies to the reactionary right in the same way that it applies to perhaps the Occupy protesters, so that there's a qualitative difference between the fascisms of Father Coughlin, who did identify populist monetary politics as state organized and perpetually a process of state contestation, versus the way in which those in the Bitcoin movement are trying to flee from that project. And I was wondering if Jakob, if that accorded with how you're framing your moral political ideological project.
I think that makes a lot of sense, yes. In the US context, I think in Europe there are far-right parties, and there's a couple of articles that have come out or are about to come out, but one is by Melinda Cooper, where different far-right parties have espoused anti-austerity by politicizing money. So yes.
Okay. I was going to end with a few questions of myself, but we can take them offline. The first one is Nathan. So bills of credit, what I would have thought the distinction between a banknote and a bill of credit was that a banknote was a credible claim for gold and silver, or semi-credible at the very least, which does sort of bring it into alignment with the constitutional, ex-nay on the bill of credit. The question I have for David is, how opportunistic were these people who you see the people who are advocating for a quantity theory of money, and how did they utilize that opportunity? So they saw a crisis, they came in, they solved it. Is that how it was? Or was it politicians went looking for them? In the paper, it seems a little bit ambiguous, so I'm kind of curious which story you would privilege there. And finally, with Jakob, I'm curious what a moral economy of money would look like in the present. Is this it, or something else? How do you envision? What would qualify as a moral economy in the present? We could take that offline, or yeah, we will. Thank you all so much. Thanks, of course, to Chris and everybody for bringing us together. This has been magnificent.